खोजो 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 खोजो
सभी को प्रणाम. Hello. Um Jumping straight into, well, the discussion and blurring lines between Indian history or history and mythology. I'd like to begin by quoting the festival director Vikram Sampath himself in his book Brave Hearts of Bharat, Vignettes from Indian History. He writes in the prologue, like all other things, in historiography too, there has been a very unique Indic way of historiography, exemplified by this shlok, often attributed to Kashmir's historian Kalhan in his seminal work, the Raj Tarangini. Dharmarth kam mokshanam upadesha samanvitam kathayuktam parvaruttam itihasa tachakshmate. Parvaruttam or narratives of the past that are in story form or kathayuktam and impart updesh or instruction in the four limbs of humanity's pursuits: dharma, righteousness; arth, which means material pursuits; kam, sensual pleasures; and moksha, liberation, is called itihas, literally translating to "it thus happened." And I think that very introduction brings us broadly in the beginning of this session. I'd like to begin with you, Amiji. First, congratulations for two wonderfully written works. And in fact, even Ashwin sir, it was a right question just behind stage as to the number of books you've written, all of them shuffling between and discussing history, discussing mythology, and bring it all together. Amiji, so you delve into a topic, or rather, both of your works delve into a discussion between myths, or so to say myths, and itihasa. Because there are preconceived notions, there are preconceived ideas, there are thoughts that people in general have about Indian history or ancient history that you take on basically head on in your works. I want you to discuss and tell the audience, because although we've been talking about these points for a few years now, but definitely there's a scope for the fresh and the younger audience to understand the difference and nuances between the two. I'd like you to explore that in your response.
Thank you, Arjun. Namaste, everybody. Shubh Sandhya. So happy to be here amongst all of you. So itihas and mythology, itihas and Puran. So history. As we all know, the definition of history typically means story of the past, something that is verifiable, something that is real, versus the way mythology is understood. It is a set of beliefs of a group of people. It may or may not be true. One that has to deal with gods, demigods, all of that. This is how dictionaries, define the two terms. So somehow it has so happened that for when people talk about India, itihas, history, everything that we consider itihas is made just mythology and not itihas. Now, my question always was, how does our parampara, how does the tradition see history and mythology in our tradition? Do we really have these categories, or is it all one? So, Arjun, I was very, very fascinated to find that the way our rishis have categorized the literature is very elaborate. We have Shrutis, Smritis. Now, within the Smritis, we have Dharma Shastras, we have Vedangas, we have Itihas, Puran, we have Darshanas, all of that. Clearly, when the rishis said something was Itihas versus something was Puran versus something was Dharma Shastra, they knew what they were talking about. They did not confuse, okay? And then as you just defined history, as you defined Itihas from Vikram's book, I'll just repeat that. It says, Dharma artha kama mokshanam upadesham samanvitam purva vrittam katha yuktam itihasam prachakshate. Purva vrittam. Something that happened in the past. Very, very clearly, no confusion. That is the definition given to us for itihas. Something that happened in the past, but narrated in a katha format. And it had a purpose, not just documentation, but a larger purpose. The larger purpose was to teach us the lessons of life. As you rightly mentioned, dharma, artha, kama, moksha. That said, there was also an understanding that there is something which is itihasa, which means so it was, asa, which is the root word to be, yeah, asati. So itihas is called itihas, which is something that had happened for sure. It might have been told to us in a katha format. Also, there is something called as Puranas, which is many very often spoken with itihas, but it is still separate. It is not called itihas. Yeah, the difference being in Purans, the person who wrote it or composed it eventually was not necessarily present when it happened, unlike itihas. So when we say two books are called itihas, Vyasji rachit Mahabharat and Valmiki ji rachit Ramayana. Nothing else is called itihas, at least in that era, yeah? And then we have Puranas, which are Vishnu Puran, Garud Puran, Shiv Puran, you name it, where we talk about the demigods and all of that. So clearly from tradition, they were clear what they were calling history and what they were calling Purans. And in the itihas itself, there was a little bit of understanding that to ensure that people understood, there were some metaphors used, there was some exaggeration done, yeah? Now, I can go into it in detail, but without that, I'll just give one simple example. Why sometimes people think that ये तो सब मिथ्या है, ये सब false है, ये केवल कथाएं हैं और इसमें इतिहास नहीं है. This is not an academic criticism. But somebody recently told me, they said, ma'am, आप बोलते हो इतिहास, but आप मुझे एक बात बताइए, दुर्योधन, दुशासन, उनका नाम ही बुरा है. सो विलन्स का नाम ही उन्होंने बुरा लग दिया है. ऐसा कैसा इतिहास हो सकता है? उनको क्या पहले से पता था ये बुरे हैं? सो आई आस्क्ड द पर्सन, आई एम श्योर अ लॉट ऑफ यू माइट हैव दिस क्वेश्चन, कि ऐसा कैसा जो विलन है उसका नाम ही बुरा रख दिया पहले से, क्या पता था वो बुरे हैं? सो देन आई आस्क्ड दैट पर्सन कि मुझे एक बात बताओ, आपको दुर्योधन का नाम का अर्थ पता है? एंड दे वर लाइक, हाँ, दू मतलब कुछ तो खराब है. आई सेड नहीं, दुर्योधन का अर्थ होता है दुखेन योधनीयम, दुखेन युध्यते असौ. उसको वो जिसके साथ लड़ना अत्यंत कठिन है, जिसको हराना अत्यंत कठिन है. अब मुझे बात बताओ, दुर्योधन का अर्थ अच्छा हुआ या बुरा? एंड इंटरेस्टिंगली महाभारत में जो कौरव है वो तो दुर्योधन को दुर्योधन बुलाते हैं, बट कई बार द्रौपदी है, युधिष्ठिर है, जो पांडव है, वो दुर्योधन को सुयोधन बुलाते हैं. तो कई बार क्या हुआ ना, बिकॉज ऑफ इवन द फिक्शन दैट इज रिटन, उन्होंने दुर्योधन को सुयोधन कह दिया. क्यों? क्योंकि सुयोधन अच्छा नाम है, बट सुयोधन मीन्स वन हु इज डिफीटेड इजीली. So that is why the Pandavas called him that. Yeah. So many a times we think these things are just mythology, especially our itihas, because we think we know them, but actually we don't. This is a very small example of that, and over time I'll probably speak more on it.
Yes. So the same question for you as well, Ashwinji, because Amiji has explored the Vedic literature, she's talked about the Puranic literature, she's given the idea broad of understanding the canvas of what itihasa means. I want you to step further, because your work essentially from the Bharat series dabbles into mythical accounts or mythology, as many would. I have heard you on multiple platforms talking and exploring this idea. So how do you differentiate between the two?
To my mind, first of all, what is mythology? What is a myth? I think one of the best definitions was C.S. Lewis, who said a myth is a lie that reveals a truth. So in that sense, what may sound fantastical is ultimately getting at a deeper truth. And it is for us to be able to dig that deeper truth and get at it. But in that sense, we like to believe that a myth is not real. It is fiction. And on the other hand, we like to treat history as what we consider to be factual. Itihas, as it happened, and so on and so forth. My favorite definition of history is George Santayana, who said that history is a pack of lies about events that never happened, written by people who were never there. In that sense, history is also just a version of events. And it is impossible to take out the bias of the narrator from the narrative. So you have an event in 1857, which school children in India are taught that this was the first war of Indian independence. It is also sometimes called the Great Rebellion of 1857. But on the other hand, in the United Kingdom, it is rarely ever taught in schools because colonial history is missing from the school curriculum. But even if you went to a master's level, it would be taught to you, but as the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857. So मतलब नज़ारा एक है, but जो देखने का तरीका है, वो बिल्कुल अलग है.
नज़रिया अलग होगा.
बिल्कुल नज़रिया अलग हो गया. तो the point is that, to my mind, there are enough things within what we consider to be history, which we could actually consider to be fiction. And there are many things in fiction which sometimes are far more truthful than history. So my view always has been that can we possibly bridge the gap between what we consider to be very well-defined disciplines. So, I mean, you know, when one of the incidents which occurred to me when I was just starting out as a writer, I had been invited to speak at a festival in Kolkata at a university lecture. And the thing got over early, so I had a little time. So I told the driver, I said, take me to some interesting place in Calcutta. He said, साहब आप मंदिर चलेंगे? I said, okay, चलो. Now, अगर ड्राइवर आपसे कहता है कलकत्ता में कि मैं आपको मंदिर ले चलता हूँ, तो you take it for granted कि ये देवी जी का मंदिर होगा. हम वहाँ पहुँचे. It was a very ordinary sort of place. In fact, from outside, it didn't look like a mandir. I went up the steps. In fact, in Calcutta, there is a road known as Sridhar Roy Road. So I went up the steps, went inside. I saw a green-colored throne. And there were people doing puja. They were praying, agarbattis, arti was going on. And when I looked closely on that green-colored throne, there was a portrait of Amitabh Bachchan. So I was wondering that what is this? Is he playing a joke on me? So, but when I looked at the people around me, they were seriously doing their worship. For them, this was a mandir. I came outside and I was waiting for my car to come and pick me up. And when I was waiting for the car, this little boy came with a basket and he was selling all types of things, agarbattis and phool, patte. He was selling prasad, all of that. Actually, the stuff that I should have picked up before I went in. So I didn't buy anything from him except for one little book. And that book is still preserved in my library. It's called the Amitabh Chalisa. And at that moment, I was thinking to myself, I said, okay, now this is real. But I said, Ashwin, now for a moment, imagine कि आपकी जो गाड़ी है, वो गाड़ी आपको पिकअप करने आती है, बट वो ड्राइवर का जो गाड़ी का ब्रेक है वो फेल हो जाता है, and he knocks you down and you get run over. And I die on the spot. And now, as per the karmic theory, I take rebirth 1,000 years later. But 1,000 years later, Arjun, now the cult of Amitabh worship has really caught on. And now there isn't one temple, but 1 lakh temples. But now someone comes to me and says, do you think that Amitabh could have been a real man in history? But Ami, isn't that the question we are asking about Ram and Krishna today? That could these have been real? So the way I like to think about what we like to refer to as our mythology, I have a problem with that word, but nevertheless, what we refer to as mythology is nothing else but the layers that we have applied to certain core stories that must have occurred. Because I find it difficult to believe that we could have written 300 versions of the Ramayana if there wasn't some core truth to it. And what we consider as Rishi Vyas, I do not believe that there was one Rishi Vyas. I believe that there were probably hundreds of Rishi Vyases down the ages, and each one layered the. After all, you started out with something called the Jaya, which was give or take 20, 30,000 verses. Then you morphed it into something called the Bharat, which became double the size. and then it morphed into something called the Mahabharata, which became double of that. I believe that every generation added its own wisdom. So that layering is what we normally nowadays call mirch masala. That mirch masala that was added down the generations is the reason why we can discount the entire thing. But I think we run the risk that we are throwing out the baby along with the bath water.
Then perfect defense by a fiction writer or non-fiction. But so we'll take it on again because this is a wonderful trajectory we're taking in this conversation. But Amiji, you tell me how because you've explored Mahabharata and Ramayana in both your books. What is your creative process? And I want viewers who are seeing this through the medium, social media and everything, and also audience here. How do you dangle between your subject, how you dangle between what is your creative process? Because like you said, there are layers which have been added over the years, and now you're trying to write a non-fictional account of what has happened. In fact, the very geography that we are sitting in right now is very much or is written about and very much the geography of Mahabharata. Yeah. So exploring that, how do you, because they're preconceived notions. So I want you to address that angle. Yeah.
So with you, Ashwinji, completely, right? There could have been layering. And again, that is open to assumption. We can assume there is, maybe there is not. We don't know, yeah? But to your point, clearly the definition itself says that something that had happened in the past, and there is a katha aspect to it as well. There are metaphors. That said, when you actually read the text, it is not that difficult to figure out actually kya hua hoga versus metaphors. But that is for later, yeah? The question you asked is very interesting. I didn't start studying because I wanted to write. I was studying because I had questions. Exactly all these questions are things which are called dharma shastras because itihas, Mahabharata, Ramayana are not just any text, yeah? They have defined a value system for us. Even today, they have been weaponized to create narratives and propaganda against the entire civilization. So it is not as if they are trivial and they don't matter. They matter a lot. So my question was, what is it? What is the real story, right? And as Ashwinji mentioned, there are others also who say that history is written by victors. Then what is right? Is it that Pandavas were actually wrong and it is the Kauravas who were right? So then, I realized something during my research that this does not apply on Indic itihas, what is called itihas. Because one, the people who we say wrote it or composed it were contemporaries. It was not written later, they were contemporaries. Even more important, yeah, when we say there is a bias of victors, let's see who composed Mahabharata. Rishi Vedavyasa, yeah. Who was Rishi Vedavyasa? He was a rishi for sure, but he was the son of Satyavati who called upon him to do niyog with Ambalika and Ambika, who were Vichitravirya's wives, widows rather, who did not have kids, to run the lineage of the Kauravas, right? Through that, Pandu and Dhritarashtra were born. And then we have Kauravas and Pandavas. So in that sense, he is actually related in blood to Pandavas and Kauravas both. So he is not one of the court poets who is writing about history just to glorify the Pandavas for the heck of it. He is actually their blood-related grandfather. And if say we assume still there could be a bias, the bias should have been for the Kauravas because the Pandavas were also born through niyog. They were not Pandu's blood, right? So if I look at that, then the whole definition of West on history about history is written by victors does not apply here anyways. It is as unbiased as we can get about the narrative, so to say, right? So that is one aspect which made me even more confident that Mahabharata, Ramayana that we are talking about are actually histories worth knowing. And you see, the theme of all of them is dharma, of both of them. What is dharma? Why do we need to talk about it? So that we take the right lessons from it. In that sense, itihasa, because lessons, kya karna hai, kya nahi, wisdom, we get that from dharma shastras also. We get that from Upanishads also. Then what is it about itihas? Itihas is nothing but a case study of that wisdom. How do we live how do we live that wisdom in our life? What happens when we don't? What happens when we do? We always talk about Indriya Nigraha, Kam, Krodha, Lobha, Moha, Mad, Matsarya. So if you see both Ramayana and Mahabharata, the heroes and the villains are not identity based. You know, आजकल there is a trend कि सब में identity घुसेड़ दो. रामायण क्यों हुआ? Because Aryan Ram wanted to defeat the Dravidian Ravan. Yeah, that is bullshit. Sorry for my language, because Ravan was the son of Vishrashava, who's the son, Rishi Vishrashava, who's the son of Pulatsi Rishi, right? So there is no Aryan Dravidian there anyways. Everybody is called Arya in that. So it is not about identities, but it is about the wisdom that we get from Gita. It's about the wisdom we get from the Upanishads, that when somebody lives his life overcome by kam, krodha, lobha, moha, mad, matsarya, giving in to their senses, sensual indulgences only, they will end up acting in a way that is disastrous to the society, versus the others who are caring for the good of the society, right? Those are the heroes and these are the villains. Now, if this story has to come out, I have to be true to the itihas as much as I can be. Now, I want to talk about one more thing here, because another thing which Ashwinji mentioned is very, very apt. How do I know what is the true story? There are so many books, there are so many retellings, 300 Ramayans, as there is this very famous essay, right? You know, sometimes people talk about these things. However, even in that 300 Ramayans, there is only one which is Valmiki ji Rachit. Others are not written by Rishi Valmiki. They all somehow pay their obeisance to Rishi Valmiki for writing the itihas of Ram, and then they build upon it. So if I have to go by itihas, I will have to go to Ramayana, which is Valmiki Rachit Ramayana. Just one more thing on that. The Jaya Bharat Mahabharat thing, again, this is a theory. There is no manuscript of only Jaya found till today. The manuscripts that have been found are of Mahabharat, some parva of Mahabharat, either entire, either half or whatever. So this thing about building up is also only a theory, right? So when I put all this together, I was like, nahi, if I can find the right version, or if I can find Valmiki Rachit Ramayana and Vyasji Rachit Mahabharat, I'm actually sorted to talk about the itihas. And that's what I did. I used the Gita Press version, which is not exactly the critical edition, but I figured what are the difference between the two, and I referred the critical edition as needed. And for Valmiki Ramayana, actually it's not that different. Be it southern recension, northern recension, whatever, they are very similar. So that's what my point was. I wanted to be true to that story as much as I can be.
Fair enough. I get the broader understanding that, because you've given a great defense of how non-fictional or account research happens. You can go to the original or primary source and you build that story from there. But my question, now to Ashwinji, and I wanted, building it up from what Amiji said. And I understand that you don't want to be, you've talked about in your podcast that you don't want to be specified into one or two, in a box, right? But while she goes about doing some non-fictional hardcore research work, do you think in your work, which is otherwise, you hate the word as well, mythological fiction, do you end up taking creative liberty, in your canvas when you're bridging or writing a story? You definitely would pick points or stories from Puranic literature, which might, it ends up telling stories to a lot of young people because the way you weave it. But there's a possibility that you take a greater liberty, because at the end of the day, you can write on a bit all a fictional account, and that makes your job easy and makes her point or her research more pertinent. I want you to address that, sort of question.
See, the point is that, first of all, I must tell you, I make no bones about the fact that I am a fiction writer. I've never attempted to project myself as either a historian or as a scholar or as someone who knows the Shastras. I know nothing. At the end of the day, I am just a storyteller, and I am writing that story in order to entertain you. And I have always maintained that a good story is about so-called 3 E's, and they are separated out in the 70-20-10 principle. 70% of what I do is for entertainment. So if I can't entertain you, you won't turn the page. 20% is maybe stuff that you may come across in my writings, which you may not have heard of before. which you may say, Arey, I never thought that this was true or that this particular fact was there. That is the moment where I consider that maybe you are getting slightly more educated, the way I was in the process of writing that book. And finally, at the time of reaching the last chapter, I hope that you will have a batti on moment where you'll say, why didn't I think of this entire story this way? And that is what I consider to be the moment of enlightenment. So, entertain, educate, enlighten, and in 70-20-10. And I make no bones about it, that's all I'm trying to do. I remember when I had written my first novel, The Rosabal Line, and first time I had a press conference, one of the young press reporters very cheekily asked me, he said, you're an MBA in finance, you have an entire education in business, and now suddenly one fine day you decide that you are going to write a theological thriller which is based on history and spirituality and religion. What are your qualifications to write this? So I said, during the time that I was growing up, my mother always used to say that I'm a bloody good liar. I could tell a lie with a straight face. As a fiction writer, all I'm doing is spinning yarns. But the corollary to being a good liar is that you tell the lie as close to the truth as you can. Because then it makes the lie that much more believable. And how do you tell a lie close to the truth? You tell the lie close to the truth by trying to do research in order to deviate only to the extent of a couple of percentages here or there. So when I'm writing a novel, what am I doing? I normally will spend anywhere around a year in terms of whether it is the historical or the theological or the philosophical narrative, or it could be elements of geography, it could be elements of linguistics, it could be elements of science. All of that is the so-called, what you can probably call the non-fiction research that goes into writing a fictional narrative. Once I've done that, then I consider that to be the building blocks. So I make a foundation, I put up the columns and the beams so that I have a superstructure of this stuff. And then where are the gaps? Those gaps are where I put in my brick and plaster. That is where the fiction comes in. But there have been many, many instances where either I'm taking a narrative which already exists, or sometimes I may be taking a point of view which is contrary to the narrative, but you'll find it in the references at the back of my book that this runs contrary to that narrative, because I'm not attempting to pull a fast one on you. The other important point which I want to bring out, Arjun, is that many of the things that we consider to be our historical narratives, how much can we depend on those narratives? Like, for example, when I was writing Chanakya's chant, there is the Arthashastra, which most of us, at some point of time in our lives, we will end up reading the Arthashastra. But while Chanakya has written the Arthashastra, there is very little written about Chanakya. In fact, we don't even know who he was. Was he Vishnugupta? Was he Kautilya? Was he Chanakya? A reference to him is there in the Panchatantra, but that's about it. But where do we get the major part of the historical narrative of Chanakya from? We get it from the Mudra Rakshas. What is the Mudra Rakshas? A Sanskrit play. When was it written? 700 years after the supposed death of Chanakya by Vishaka Datta, written by Vishaka Datta. Vishaka Datta was writing Mudra Rakshas to be performed on stage. What if Vishaka Datta was that time's Ashwin Sanghi? He was taking fact and fiction and mixing them. But today we consider that as our narrative. The point I am making is that we now need to start understanding that there are many, many things in our historical narratives that could have been fiction, and there are many, many factual truths in our fiction which we are overlooking. Take, for example, Kalhana's Raja Tarangini. There are fantastical accounts of kings who can sprout wings and can fly. But does that imply that it is not a historical narrative of Kashmir? Certainly not. We can't get a narrative of Kashmir if we ignore that.
that brings me to the next point here. Uh, the evolution of, or the historical evolution of the Indian right-wing thought process. Um you've been writing mythological fiction, so to say, for a couple of years now. Um, Amiji, you have been writing in the last few years non-fictional accounts. In the last few years, we've seen, and I think a lot of it owes to the leadership that we have today, that many more writers, historians, biographers are coming along, coming forward and writing accounts of a thought process which demarcates or differentiates them from how we've seen in the socialist era or how we've seen in the pre-1991 days. Do you factor in the sensitivities and sensibilities of your readers and the audience while deciding on the subject that you're working on? And do you think that the timeline that we are living in today is important, and which is why it's sort of become convenient to write more on these lines? That's for you, sir.
So, honestly speaking, to give you a quick answer to that question, that do you worry about the sensibilities of your readers? I've never done it. Had I done it, I wouldn't have written the Rosabal line. Because 47 publishers and literary agents told me that there isn't a market for this. So the point is that I think this entire genre has come into existence because there are writers in this space who wanted to explore stuff that publishers didn't want to really publish. Because the publishers thought that they already knew the sensibilities of their readers. To answer the second point, which is in terms of, are we living in a time where it has become convenient? Well, no. The fact of the matter is that if I look at when was the Rosabal line written, the idea for the Rosabal line emerged sometime around 2002, when I was on a visit to Kashmir and I ended up chancing on this particular tomb, which is purportedly the resting place of Jesus Christ. Then I spent the next couple of years researching that story. At the time when I actually published that story, we were not living in a Narendra Modi era. We were living in a time which was firmly a UPA time. And I think the book was self-published by me sometime around 2007. It eventually got published in India in 2008. So we are talking about books that came out very much during a time when the political dispensation was very, very different. I think to a very great extent what has happened is that in every industry there is what is called a bit of a herd effect. That when you taste success in something, for example, in the last 70 years, why did we have more and more of the same films in Bollywood? Because a certain formula worked, and therefore more people came into that space because they said, "Ha, ye to chal jayega." It is the same thing which happened with Chetan Bhagat during the early days with campus romances. And then you suddenly had such a large number of people coming in and writing romance stories which were set on college campuses. So the point I'm making is that the reason why you have more of this happening now is because of the fact that people have already tasted success with this particular subgenre. It has very little to do with the political dispensation.
You clearly differentiate between that. Okay. What's your take on this?
सबसे पहले तो I do want to clarify that I have nothing against fiction. I have enjoyed fiction completely. I was only talking about my way of writing, where I think when itihas starts getting weaponized and starts creating fissure in the society, sometimes we just need to take a step back and see what the actual narrative was, right? Because so much gets written, and I have immense respect for you, Ashwinji. You actually write your references. You do your research, you write your references, and you do not create a story with an agenda in mind. It's purely for entertainment, which actually even educates, yeah? So that's been fantastic. In fact, because of this kind of work, people get interested in actual itihas going forward. So let there be more fiction be written, but I would only want to caution that when people start thinking they've become historians and their retelling is actually true, then it becomes a problem, which sometimes happens, yeah? That said, about the sensibilities...
Has it happened, you would argue, or you're arguing that it can or it has happened?
So, for example, what I mentioned, right, that lot of people say actually Aryan Dravidian, Ram Ravan Yuddha was Aryan Dravidian. people say Mahabharat was all about casteism, it was all about misogyny, right? And वैसे तो they'll say it is all itihas, it is not itihas, it is only mythology. सब कथाएं हैं, सब झूठ है. But when they want to denigrate the civilization, they'll say, अरे आप में तो जातिवाद इतने वर्षों से था, look at Karn, right? Now, the actual, the heroification of Karn is not what we see in Mahabharat at all, yeah? Whatever happens to him is not because of his jati. It is not because of, where he was born or anything. It happens to him because of his karma and the decisions he made in life. It is not because of his jati at all. In fact, I'll just take one example there. People say, अरे जातिवाद नहीं था तो फिर द्रोणाचार्य ने कर्ण को पढ़ाने से क्यों मना कर दिया? द्रोणाचार्य ने कर्ण को पढ़ाने से मना नहीं किया. He was a student. Karna was a student of Dronacharya. Yeah? He was the one who left Dronacharya because he wanted to learn the Brahmastra. And Dronacharya said, you are not ready to learn the Brahmastra. Dronacharya did not teach Brahmastra to anybody else. And that's when he said, I'll go to Parshuram, right? So the whole narrative is changed in this fashion where sometimes problems of the present are projected to the past. And then our past is weaponized to again whip us in the present. Yeah, that's what I have an issue with.
But more on these questions and conversations later. But if there's someone in the audience who has a question for our lovely speakers here. Anyone? I see a few hands there, please. Do tell your name and please direct your questions to...
Yeah, my name is Siddharth. Question is to Ashwin sir. While writing Magicians of Mazda, what sort of similarities did you find in pre-Islamic Iran or Persia that we find in Vedic India in the similar time frame, if you could?
Ashwin ji, we are looking for quick responses. Okay. The time is looking at me.
No, we don't have 10 minutes.
We can definitely take 2 questions, but okay. Quick responses.
No, I think with Magicians of Mazda, honestly, for me also it was a learning experience because suddenly I realized that there were so many things. For example, I always knew that we were talking about a central character within the world of Zoroastrianism called Ahura Mazda. But then on the other hand, when I started going back into our own Vedas, then I found that we have another character which is basically Varuna, who's considered to be the greatest of the Asuras. And a reference to him is Asura Maya. And so in that sense, then suddenly it becomes evident to me that there was possibly a transposition of Asura Maya being connected in some ways with Ahura Mazda. Or for example, the idea that the entire possible conflict between Bhrigu and Brihaspati could have been a reason for the so-called conflict of the 10 kings, which resulted in a movement beyond the Saraswati of a certain part of the civilization, which then eventually flowered into a new religion or a new religious thought process. Or the idea that the so-called, the reason for the so-called purity that we talk about is because of the Shvetambaras. So there were many, many connections that I found between our Vedic thought process and between what was written in the Gathas. So in that sense, if you actually put the Rig Veda and the Gathas side by side, except for the fact that in terms of sequencing and in terms of the pronunciation and inflection points, they are pretty much similar. And yes, for me also, that was a learning experience and a learning journey. So I frankly ended up finding out things which I didn't know when I started writing that book.
Yes.
So I hope that probably that learning journey has translated for you also in terms of reading it.
Quick second question, please.
My question is from Ami ma'am. Hi ma'am, I'm Manas. Ma'am, we have heard that the Battle of Troy was also a mythology, and as the time goes on, the researches were done on that. We are hearing now that it was true. So, is it need to be more research on Mahabharata and Ramayana in India?
Yeah, there is always scope for more research, and we should definitely encourage as much research as possible, which is also happening. Archaeology की खुदाई चले जा रही है. We know there are some advances there. Astrophysics, astronomy को use करके dating कर रहे हैं. That should definitely be there. But I would also say this. there is a certain view which the tradition has, which we don't necessarily need to discount only because it doesn't fit in the framework of the West. Yeah? Because if we look at what even they consider history, has enough mythological aspects to it. For example, let's talk about the birth of Jesus. I have nothing against Christianity, right? The birth of Jesus is, we call it Immaculate Conception. It has happened without the normal procedure, right? Is it not a mythological aspect? But we still consider it to be history. Yeah.
You're opening
So yeah,
a new
anyways,
conversation,
so
new
I'll say,
session there.
I'll say we don't necessarily, we should still do research, but not limit ourselves to the parameters and the
Can
framework
I
of
add
the
one
past.
line? One line
Just
I want
one
to
line,
add, which is that when I was writing the Krishna key, I came across this, Ami will probably know better, but I came across this particular line which talked about Rishi Vyas going and meeting Dhritarashtra on the eve of the battle and saying that don't fight this battle because these are the stars that I have seen. And there is a professor by the name of Narhari Achar in the University of Memphis who actually did studies in order to look at the night skies over Kurukshetra over a period of some 10 or 20,000 years. And eventually he came up with only a single date, which was 3067 BC. So in that sense, now today technology is enabling us to dig into many, many things which earlier we could not. We were challenging the very existence of the Saraswati River. Today now satellites are telling us that that Saraswati existed. Today now we are being able to dig down and see when was the last electrical recharge of the waters under Jaisalmer and Jodhpur. And it's showing us that the paleo channels were stopped flowing about 5,000 years ago. So all of this is now happening.
So yes, more research and historical as well as geological research continues. With that note, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Quite enjoyed the conversation
you.
and speaking with you. I hope you had a good time. Hope you got to learn a few things.